doesn't make any sense, is instead of as. But anyway, in preparation for the homily, I looked up the word king in Wikipedia just to make sure that the definition hasn't changed. And guess what? Of course, it hasn't. And as you all know, a king is a form of government called a monarchy. And a king was a hereditary ruler allegedly chosen by God who would exercise unlimited and unchecked individual power over his subjects. And we know from history that kings often, most often, did not rule in the interest of their country, but rather in their own interest, in the interest of their family and their courtiers and the, well, what else did they say in the first reading? Thus, the adoption of kingship as a form of government has always been most problematic. About 3,000 years ago, the prophet Samuel is describing the very serious drawbacks of living under a monarchy. He will take your children, he will take your slaves, he will take your grain, your harvest, he will take everything. Perhaps the Israelites thought that they were different. You know, a lot of people think that just because it's them, their rule is going to be different, and that their monarchy would produce a kinder, gentler type of king. And history, of course, proved them wrong. And perhaps our first reading is an example of buyer's remorse. A more likely explanation for the origin of the Hebrew monarchy is that Saul, and then David and Solomon, dispatched the tribal rulers known as judges and usurped the power for themselves. And that God probably, most probably, had nothing to do with it. And while Saul is portrayed as being bad from the beginning, David and Solomon are colored over with the rosy glow of righteousness. But if you plow through the 2 books of Samuel, and if you read Kings and Chronicles, if you can get yourself through that, you will learn that all 3 were corrupted by absolute power and that their successors were no different. So it was surely a lack of imagination that made civilizations repeatedly choose this flawed form of governance when there were always other forms available. But of course, that's a topic for a history lesson, not a homily. Anybody watch The Revolution this week? Ken Burns? You might want to watch it. Wikipedia commented on the fact that most modern states have some sort of elected democratic government rather than a king. And they basically got rid of royalty by revolution or just by popular mandate. Because a monarch with his attendant kingdom no longer makes sense to modern people except as a fairy tale. And we know that fairy tales leave out a lot of reality. So although monarchies were falling left and right after World War I as people moved towards democracy, Pius XI officially declared Jesus as king in 1925, during the Roaring '20s, after women got the right to vote in the United States. He did this, he said, to combat the growing nationalism and secularism in the Western world. Pius also said that the kingly authority of Jesus ensures real liberty and well-ordered discipline, peace, and harmony. And he also urged citizens to obey their rulers. And get this, ladies, and he ordered women to obey their husbands. Whenever somebody says that, you know you're in trouble, right? In 1969, during the height of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement in the United States and student unrest in Europe, Paul VI declared Jesus to be the king of the universe, just in case his flock didn't get the picture. The institution's fixation on a king remains true today on this feast day, where Jesus is declared the king of an expanding universe, teeming with planets, solar systems, galaxies, and perhaps other forms of life. Set in historical context, the use of the word king, with all its unsavory connotations, is really not a useful title, especially since Jesus himself rejected the title. Years ago, when I was at a retreat, the retreat leader offered us a quote from one of my favorite theologians, Meister Eckhart. It is a lie, any talk of God that does not comfort you. And I think Jesus, who referred to God as Daddy, would probably agree. Although I want to acknowledge that some people might find King less than useful, they might also find Daddy less than useful. So I just want to state that. So Jesus was a good Jew, and Jewish ideas about God were far, far more nuanced. And this nuance has been their greatest gift to us. The Hebrews would not even name God, hence the title Yahweh, which is probably not the right pronunciation or the right spelling. The vowels were just added, so some people who were daring enough to say the word could say it. A better definition is the breath of life. So I read somewhere that it's when you breathe in Yah, and you breathe out way. So God is essentially the breath of life. The ancients also had no trouble calling God a rock, a mother hen, a fortress, or a mother giving birth. And unlike modern Christians, they never concretized their metaphors because they knew that no name, no idea, no theology could accommodate the mystery that is God, nor could an artistic representation. God was just too big for them. Muslims, as you know, also do not portray God in the visual arts. On the other hand, Christians not only paint God as the white guy in the sky, sadly like Zeus and Thor, but they also define him in very human terms that they call doctrines of faith. The language they use in these doctrines is both hierarchical and patriarchal, words that are not comforting to far too many. But God, as we all know, is not just the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, two men and a bird, as Sandra Snyder's often referred to the Trinity, or a supreme being. God, as all of you know, is far more than all of these confusing words. Mystics whose reflections often take second fiddle to unprovable doctrine formulated by men with a vested image of maintaining power over their flock have no trouble describing the divine. Hildegard of Bingen described God as a strong woman wearing a gold band around her head who announces, I am the supreme and fiery force who sets all living sparks. In our second reading, Meister Eckhart described God as simple. Can you imagine? And without dualities. Loving God, he said, just requires no human images or words like doctrines and requires no intermediary to explain them. In fact, he said, these mental images do nothing but detract from God because believers will worship the image rather than the source. Native Americans venerated the Great Spirit or the Creator in a faith that honored the earth and everything in it. Plants, animals, and natural sites were sources of revelation rather than just words. Like Native Americans, the theologian Paul Tillich rejected a separation between God above and the world below. God, he said, was not a name or a definition of terms, but rather a structure that underlies all that exists and holds everything together. The human title king attached to the source of all being and the breath of life, of course, tends to obscure all this. And too often it has made Christians feel satisfied in worshiping King Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, rather than advancing his mission of justice, courage, humanity, and love, a much, much harder task. While we also have the image of the vulnerable baby in the stable and the scourged man with the crown of thorns, the grand gold-plated basilicas and the lace and velvet of those who would be the image of Jesus convey a very different picture. And so we know that God has always walked among us. And so the comforting image of God is not one who comes on the cloud of heaven, wearing a crown and wielding judgment, but the humble gestures of the person who gives a cold water to a thirsty person. And so I'll end again with Eckhart, as I said, my favorite. How long will grown men and women in this world keep drawing in their coloring books an image of God that makes them feel sad or angry or vindictive, for that matter, because God, as we all know, is love pressed down and overflowing into our lap.